Hello guys, welcome back to the MMA Sucker Podcast. My name is Frazer Krohn, and as you can see, I'm on my own this week. There's some news about the podcast going forwards. Obviously, we haven't recorded in a couple of weeks, and that was because we had the unfortunate news that Tim won't be doing the podcast anymore due to other commitments. Myself and Tim have worked together on the podcast for, I think, roughly 3 years. It's been a load of fun. I've learned so much from Tim. He's one of the most knowledgeable guys out there in the world of MMA journalism. He does some brilliant work, especially around the sort of kickboxing and Muay Thai scene. And like I say, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with Tim over these past few years. I wish him all the best in his endeavors. I can't thank him enough for all the knowledge that he's passed on to me just from, speaking on the podcast each and every week. He's just so knowledgeable about about combat sports, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we'll be able to get Tim on, as a guest, as it were. A couple of podcasts in the future, maybe for the bigger events. Looking ahead to the John Jones Stipe Miocic fight. Maybe if Conor McGregor returns, we'll be able to get him on for a couple of one-off episodes. But week in, week out, it'll just be me on my own for now. I am on the lookout for another sort of permanent co-host or permanent sort of guest, as it were, on the podcast. So if you yourself are interested, or if you know anyone that would be interested in sitting down each and every sort of Monday or Tuesday with myself to discuss all the goings on in the world of MMA and just having a bit of fun and discussing the sport, drop in the comments below, drop MMA Sucker a message on Twitter or Instagram, drop myself a message on Twitter at Frazer Krohn MMA, and we can have that chat and see what we can work out. But yeah, going forward, it'll just be me on my own. So the podcast will be slightly shorter. I'm going to bring in a few different features. With the podcast being shorter, I can then, talk a little bit more about fight announcements on my own, because we won't have Tim's sort of input for the discussion. So it'll just be me, my input. And we're really going to try and, bring in different features, like I say, discuss fight announcements more, a little bit more, maybe video breakdowns if we can arrange that. Going to be doing a lot more, or going to be at least trying to have a lot more guests on the podcast. As far as sort of interviews, guests, we're going to try and get Melissa Dixon back on the podcast ahead of her UFC debut in October. I know she's out in America at the moment, but when she returns to the UK, we're going to try and get her on, and going to just be sending out a lot of feelers out there. And it's a new era for the podcast now. It's definitely slightly different with Tim not being here. But like I say, I wish him all the best in his endeavors, and it's a shame that we won't be able to get do the podcast each and every week. But it is what it is. It's a crazy industry that myself and Tim sort of operate within, and sometimes you've got to put some stuff on the back burner. But yeah, I just want to say a big shout out and a big thank you to Tim Wheaton. Continue to follow his work, because he's, like I say, he's one of the best out there. Some of the interviews that he does, and some of the breakdown and analysis and previews that you do are second to none. So yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to Tim for all the great years on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to the new era of the MMA Sucker podcast. So this podcast will be slightly different. While I'm just, I've done solo podcasts before, but I am just, getting used to doing it on my own now. I'm not having Tim to bounce off. I'm not having Tim to sort of lead the discussion. But it is what it is. Bear with me. It might be a rocky road for a few weeks until I sort of get into my flow, until I get more of a schedule going. But believe it, trust in the process a little bit, because I'm hoping that I'll still, I really enjoy doing this podcast. If I have to do it on my own, I have to do it on my own. But trust in the process. Bear with me a little bit, and let's jump straight into it, because I haven't sat down for a few weeks and to discuss anything MMA, as it were. But we've got an absolutely gigantic card this weekend, UFC 292. We also had one of the best fight night cards, I think, maybe ever, that went down this weekend. We also got a bit of Anthony Joshua that I want to discuss this week from this past weekend. So what I'll do is I'll jump into Anthony Joshua. We'll move on to briefly discuss UFC Fight Night, because I could do a whole 2-hour show on the fight night that was, and then we're going to have to jump into UFC 292, which is one of the best events, I think, of the year. If you really sort of dig down into it and look at all the fights on the prelims, you've got 2 title fights on that card. You've got up and comers on the card. It really is one of the better fight night cards. Better pay-per-view cards we have. It has taken a slight hit with a couple of fighters having to pull out, which is a shame. But at the end of the day, it's still a really good card. But first things first, Anthony Joshua defeats Robert Helenius by 7th round knockout. Shades of the old Anthony Joshua, you could certainly say. It's his first finish in 2 years, over 2 years. But the last person he KO'd was Kubrat Pulev on the 12th of December 2020. And now the 12th of August 2023, he finishes Robert Helenius. Now, was it vintage AJ? No, it wasn't. He still seemed a little, well, to me anyway. I've only watched the fight once. I may watch it again later today. But to me, he seemed a little tentative. He seemed a little reluctant to really commit to getting in there and really sort of swinging away at Robert Helenius. Granted, he took this fight on short notice. Dillian Whyte failed the drug test last week. It was last Saturday, the Saturday before. So it would be this 5th, 6th of August, and he competed on the 12th. What I can say is I'm glad the fight still went ahead and Joshua did still get to fight. But Robert Helenius and Dillian Whyte are 2 completely different fighters. So I think you've got to hand it to AJ that he still managed to go in there and handle business. But just, it was a lot different. Helenius 6'6.5" has that style where he sort of is constantly leaning back as to not sort of get hit. He was fresh. He had competed the week before on the 5th. So he was still sharp. And you compare that to Dillian Whyte, who is 6'4" and he fights. I want to make as much sense as possible. He fights quite short. Dillian Whyte, he constantly looks to hook and get in and work in the clinch. His nickname, the body snatcher, because that's what he likes to do. He likes to get in there and hook to the body and really, work the body of Joshua. So he had to, would have looked to work the body of Joshua and then come over the top with the strikes like we saw against Derek Chisora, who consequently picked up a win this weekend as well in one of the most forgettable fights ever. But with that aside, I think you've really got to hand it to Joshua. He finally seemed a little bit interested. Against Jermaine Franklin last time out, he just didn't seem bothered at all. Which is it the level of opponent? Is it the fact that he was coming off 2 losses against Alexander Usyk and there were plenty of questions being asked about him? Who knows? But even there's no bad blood between him and Robert Helenius, but at the weigh-ins on Friday, there was certainly some heated exchanges between the two, to say the least. And that's what you need. For Anthony Joshua, I feel that he needs to be motivated by danger, as it were. We saw that against Vladimir Klitschko. Probably one of his it was his defining moment. His rematch with Andy Ruiz Jr. He knew the danger of that fight because he'd gone in there, a month, 6 months before, in New York and lost pretty convincingly. He was knocked out in that fight. Kubrat Pulev, he's a heavy hitter. He hadn't lost to a lot of people prior to losing to Joshua. He's on a big winning run. His only loss prior to losing to Anthony Joshua was against Vladimir Klitschko. Yes, he hadn't fought the who's who of the heavyweight division, as it were. He'd fought and defeated Kevin Johnson, Derek Chisora, Hughie Fury, Bogdan Dinu. These are not the elite guys. But there was still some danger in there for Joshua, and that's why he performed so well in that one. Now, for me, Joshua needs that danger, and that danger maybe came a little bit, we maybe saw a little bit of that danger from Robert Helenius, but not, it wasn't the true danger as a Deontay Wilder would bring, as a Tyson Fury, as an Alexander Usyk would bring. Even a Daniel Dubois or a Joe Parker or a Zhang, these guys bring a different level of danger because they're at the elite level of the sport. What was slightly concerning is how much Joshua was caught by the jab of Robert Helenius. You know, we've seen pictures of him, we've seen McGregor trying to, or essentially feeding him beer after the fight. That was, you know, McGregor kind of, I don't know what was going on with that, but you know, that's a discussion for another day. But yeah, it was slightly concerning how much Joshua did get from Helenius because he's not, you know, traditionally a quick fighter. You know, I think Tyson Fury would absolutely play with the Joshua that was in there on Saturday night, but the comeback trail remains. The comeback season as Joshua is kind of on at the moment remains. He gets another win. He gets back in the knockout. You know, that knockout was phenomenal. A big sort of straight right, overhand right, with just slept Helenius straight away. Helenius needed oxygen. You know, it was vintage. It was a vintage AJ finish. Was it a vintage AJ performance? We saw flashes of the old AJ, but we haven't seen. We were still yet to see that aggressive, horrible, big, heavy hitting heavyweight. Is Deontay Wilder next? For me, absolutely no chance. If I'm Team Joshua, I try and stay away from Wilder at least for one more fight. I think Joshua needs another fight at the end of the year. You know, what's August now, maybe in November, but he traditionally fights in December. I'll just pull up the heavyweight boxing rankings because I want to see who he can fight and even if it's a knockover, you know, I want to see him in there with someone who he can realistically, you know, get back in there against. We've got some names in and around the sort of top 10 of various, you know, that's the problem with boxing. We've got the Ring, WBO, IBF, WBC, WBA. We've got, you know, so many different ranking systems that Josh was ranked, you know, he's ranked number 3 with the WBA, number 3 with the WBC, number 4 with the IBF, number 2 with the WBO, and number 3 with the Ring heavyweight rankings. You've also got to think, you know, who's in there that he can have a competitive fight against, but still, you know, but still win with relative ease. Looking down the rankings now, you've got Filip Hrgovic, who looks to be next for Alexander Usyk if Usyk can get past Daniel Dubois. I think that's this weekend or the weekend after next. Well, this month anyway. I think he will. I think he'll dance around Daniel Dubois, unfortunately for Daniel. And then, you know, you may be looking at the WBC rankings. I'm looking at Otto Wallin. I'm looking at, you know, Luis Ortiz. These are guys that I really don't want them to go down this way, but they could even look, you know, at the WBA rankings, it could even look at Big Baby Miller. I wouldn't touch Big Baby Miller with a barge pole for the amount of, you know, drug failures that he's had. I just don't. I think the bloke's scum, to be honest, and I really don't think that he should get the opportunity. But, you know, stranger things have happened, unfortunately. What I would say for Anthony Joshua is I want to see him out. I want to see him have another fight before taking on Deontay Wilder. Then I want to see him take on Deontay Wilder. You know, it's a heavyweight clash that we've all been wanting for years, and it's an exciting one. But, you know, it wasn't vintage AJ. He did get the victory. He did get the knockout victory. He's back in the win column, which is the most important thing for him. What I would say is, you know, just step back a little bit, you know, enjoy the win and then regroup and go again. And it's certainly exciting. And while we're on the subject of exciting performances, UFC Fight Night Luque versus Dos Anjos. How many finishes were on this game? 9 finishes in 13 fights, including a twister submission. I believe it's only the 4th twister submission in UFC history. We've had Bryce Mitchell, we've had Chan Sung Young, and we've had the first one of the guy's name that just evades me at the moment. But that was on the second fight. We have a women's flyweight, which, you know, no disrespect, but traditionally the women tend not to finish the fights. The heavier hands just aren't there. Luana Santos finishes Juliana Miller in the first round. Bang, we're off to a great start. Then we get a twister submission from Damon Blackshear in the second fight. Wow, we're up to a really good start. Women's strawweight, Jacqueline Amori defeats Montserrat Ruiz in 86 significant strikes landed. Total strikes 141-20 and finishes it by TKO in the third round. Domination. Then we've got a submission. Martin Buday submits Josh Partizan. Josh Parisian in the first round by Kimura. So we've got 4 finishes, 4 fights, 4 finishes. Then we're going to the Isaac Dullagrail finish in the first round. Terence McKinney, dominant finish over Mike Breeden in the first round. T-Rex living up to his name. You know, he started with so much hype in the UFC, 7-second knockout in his debut against Matt Frevola, and then a submission victory. Then he loses to Drew Dober, but had hurt Drew Dober. Bounces back against Eric Gonzalez, then loses to Ismail Bonfim, loses to Nazmir Sadikov last time out in July, returns less than a month later and secures the first round TKO. It's great to see Terence McKinney back in there. So now we're talking 6 fights, 6 finishes. And then we get the bantamweight fight between JP Byers and Marcus McGee. Marcus McGee, bang, runs through JP Byers in 2 minutes and 19 seconds. Another finish. Then we have 2 back-to-back decision victories. Josh Frem defeats Jamie Pickett and AJ Dobson defeats Nchukwi. The fact that the decisions are now coming at a surprise to us just speaks volumes to how good this fight night was. Poliana Viana loses via arm triangle next in the next fight, to Lucindo. Really good performance. I think Lucindo is mega young. Yeah, born 2002. Crazy that someone born in 2002 is out here getting a performance of the night bonus for a really good submission. Then you've got, for me, the performance of the night, Khalil Roundtree versus Chris Daukaus. Khalil Roundtree smashes through Chris Daukaus in the first round in what many thought would be sort of Chris Daukaus' almost, coming out party. He started his UFC career really well. 4-0, 4 finishes. Only saw the second round once against Shamil Abdurakhimov. He defeated Parker Porter. He defeated Alexei Oleinik in there as well. Then he came up against Derek Lewis in the main event. Derek Lewis ran through him. Then he came up against Curtis Blades in the main event. Curtis Blades ran through him. Then he came up against Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Jairzinho Rozenstruik ran through him. 3 knockout losses on the spin. What's interesting to me is that these guys are the elite of the division. Lewis, Curtis Blades, Rozenstruik. These are some elite heavyweights that he's losing to, and it kind of, in a way, it is what it is against these guys. If these guys touch you and hit you, you're going to sleep, and that's what happened for Chris Daukaus. He's dropped down in weight now to 205, and he's still getting finished, which is, that's seriously worrying for Chris Daukaus. But for Khalil Roundtree, that's his 4th straight win now. 3 of which have come via knockout. He knocked out Madeo Bukauskas with that knee stomp. Knocked out Carl Roberson, earning performance of the night. He went to a split decision with Dustin Jacoby, who's one of the best kickboxers on the roster, as we saw last week against Nzekuchu. And now he finishes Chris Daukaus, and it was just a big, strong punch down the pipe, knocking Chris Daukaus down. He called for a main event slot, Khalil Roundtree, and for me, that makes sense. He said, I want to be ready for a title. I want to be ready for 5 rounds. How better to be ready for 5 rounds than compete in a main event? Something that we'll go on to talk about when we talk about Sean O'Malley, because Sean O'Malley is in the main event this weekend, and yet he's never even gone 5 rounds. He's never been scheduled for 5 rounds in the UFC. How much is that going to play a factor this weekend? We'll have to wait and see. But it's sensible from Khalil Roundtree asking for a main event. Who could Khalil face in a main event? Murazaradov, I think would be a good main event, fun main event. Alexander Rakic, he's obviously coming off the TKO loss against Jan Blachowicz, and that was obviously came with a sort of the caveat of the injury. These guys are Rakic is ranked 5, Khalil Rountree ranked 13. Maybe do you get a Ryan Spans obviously fighting Anthony Smith, the winner of that maybe can face Khalil in a main event. But Khalil's got a phenomenal backstory, and I really do think that he deserves a main event slot. The co-main event, Cub Swanson defeats Hakeem Dawodu by split decision. He didn't win the fight. I think he knows he didn't win the fight. But, if you leave it in the hands of the judges, that's always the risk that you're running, especially, in Hakeem Dawodu's case. For me, Hakeem Dawodu's never really lived up to the hype that we thought he might. He entered the UFC, and I was there for his debut, and he lost in 39 seconds to Danny Henry via guillotine choke. He then went on an impressive 5-fight winning run, and then he ran into Movsar Evelev. Then he beat Matruzano, then he lost to Julian Erosa, and now he's lost to Cub Swanson. The thing is, he's finished one fight in the UFC. For someone that's meant to be an elite kickboxer, he's just sort of slipping into mediocrity at the moment. And for Cub, great to get back in the win column for Cub Swanson. He's had 42 fights, 43 fights, maybe 39 years of age, and he doesn't look like he's going to be hanging up. He's a win one, lose one fighter. Is he going to be a UFC champion? I highly doubt it. Is he going to lose 10 on the spin? Again, I highly doubt it. He's always game. He's always a name, and I'm glad that he managed to get back in the win column. That went the full 15 minutes. Again, a surprise because we're used to so many finishes. And another surprise is that Vicente Luque and RDA went the full 25 minutes. Vicente Luque jumping back in the win column for the first time since August 2021. So it's been, almost over 2 years since he tasted victory. This fight for me was a little bit underwhelming. Vicente Luque just sort of managed to dominate large periods of the fight by taking RDA down and kind of just dominating him on the floor, being the physically bigger guy in there. I'm surprised that there wasn't a finish in this one because both of these guys are finishers, but it is what it is. Vicente Luque drops back into the win column. He essentially called out Dustin Poirier to welcome Dustin Poirier to welterweight. I'm not sure if that's actually happening, but it's an exciting fight if it does happen for sure. And for RDA, it's a shame that he's lost another fight, but he's always going to be a contender. He's not ranked. He was fighting a ranked guy. He had nothing to lose apart from the fight itself, of course. But RDA will continue to be relevant and will continue to be in big fights. And I'm happy that he is continuing to be in big fights because he deserves it after the career that he's had. But now we have to move on to UFC 292. Right. This card from top to bottom is really, really good. Right. So we've got 2 title fights. We've got maybe the hottest prospects in the sport today. We've got 2 game bantamweights on the card. We've got the return of a legend. We've got an all-action middleweight. We've got, a highly ranked and highly skilled flyweight, women's flyweight. So let's just jump straight into it. Gonna start on literally going to start from the first fight. Just a couple of comments up until the main couple of fights on the card. Kurt Hallbar versus Austin Hubbard, the final of TUF. Apologies if you haven't seen it, but it is what it is. It's out there now. These guys are essentially fighting for a UFC contract again. Both guys have performed really well on the show, especially Austin Hubbard. When he did get cut from the UFC, he was off the back of 1 loss, and he had a good UFC run. That should be a really entertaining one. Tapology have got them opening up the card. I'm not sure if they will or not, but that's what Tapology have got as it stands. You got Marina Moroz versus Karine Silva. Moroz had returned after 2 years away, defeated Maria Agapova, had 2 cancelled fights against Yajara Eubanks. Eubanks obviously then was cut from the UFC. Moreau's faced Jennifer Maia and lost that fight by decision. We know how good Jennifer Maia is. Karine Silva looks like a, as her nickname might suggest, it looks like a killer. She's undefeated. She's 2-0 in the UFC. Both via finish, both via sub finish. She's enjoying a 7-fight winning run. She just looks like a really good prospect, and Moreau's really got to mind her P's and Q's. Andrea Lee returns. Andrea Lee, again, similar to what I was saying earlier about Hakeem Dawood, has never really seemed to kick on to the potential that we thought she might have. She lost 2 on the bounce now to Vivian Araujo and lost that split decision to Macy Barber last time out. She takes on Natalia Silva. Natalia Silva enjoying, I can't even count, 2, 4, 6, 9-fight winning run, 2-0 in the UFC. 2 knockout finishes, massive step up in competition for Silva, but she looks like she can take that step up in competition and really do well. Jihad Meerschaert returns for what seems like his 100th fight. It is in fact his 51st fight, I think 51st fight, but the 35-year-old he's taken on Andre Petroski in this one. Petroski, massive winning run again. Defeated Nick Maximov, defeated Wellington Turman, defeated OSP at Fury Grappling. Did lose last time out in a grappling match, but that should be a decent middleweight fight. You've then got the all-action Gregory Robocop Rodriguez, who really made a name for himself last year for just being game. He's just a fun fighter. He defeated Todorovic. He defeated Todorovic in his debut, Jung-Yun Park via TKO, lost a split decision to Armen Petrosian, then beat Julian Marquez, then beat Chidi and Chidi, you know who I'm on about. Lost last time out against Bruno Ferreira. Now he faces Dennis Tulin, who, again, is always game. He lost to Jung-Yun Park last time out, but this should be a really all-action fight. And then we get into what is a massive fight, I feel. Chris Weidman, the returning Chris Weidman. We haven't seen Chris Weidman since April of 2021, where we only got to see him for 17 seconds after he broke his leg against Uriah Hall. This is a massive fight for Chris Weidman. He's back at middleweight. He did have that slight jaunt up to light heavyweight when he faced Dominic Reyes. Let's not forget, Chris Weidman is the man that ended Anderson Silva's winning run. He dominated Lyoto Machida. He finished Vitor Belfort. Then he lost to Luke Rockhold, lost to Yoel Romero, lost to Gegard Mousasi. Then he bounced back against Calvin Gastelum. But then he was knocked out against Jacare, knocked out against Dominic Reyes. Then he bounced back in a boring decision against Akhmedov. And then he broke his leg pretty fucking badly against Uriah Hall. Where's he at in his career? In Chris Weidman's head, he's still the best middleweight on the planet. He's 39 years old now. How much has he got left? I think a big win here in Boston against Brad Tavares, who's obviously, who's his opponent. I think, and I hope we see him lay down the gloves. I don't want to see anyone retire, but I don't want to force anyone into retirement. Sorry, but I think it's looking like it might be time for Chris Weidman. He takes on, like I say, Brad Tavares. Tavares coming off 2 losses. Decision against Dricus du Plessis and a loss against Bruno Silva last time out in April. It's a recognisable name. I'm thinking that Chris Weidman gets it done here just because he's going to be riding a lot of momentum into that one, but who knows. We've then got Marlon Vera versus Pedro Munoz. Munoz stepping in on late notice for Henry Cejudo, which is certainly, I say late notice, it's not too late notice, but it's certainly disappointing that Cejudo couldn't make the walk at UFC 292. This should be a great fight. Marlon Vera coming off that, dominant and kind of underwhelming loss to Corey Sandhagen. He was on such a good run prior to that. He defeated Davey Grant, Frankie Edgar by finish, Rob Font. He dominated him across 25 minutes. Finished Dominic Cruz in the 4th round of their fight. Then was just outworked, outthought, outfought by Corey Sandhagen, which was, to be honest, a little bit of a disappointing performance by Marlon Vera. And he takes on Pedro Munoz in this one. Munoz, who got back in the win column after what seemed like a long time without a win. I know it was, it was only sort of 2 years without a win. He lost to Jose Aldo, he lost to Dominic Cruz, and then he had that eye. He got poked in the eye by the main event star Sean O'Malley. He bounced back against Chris Gutierrez last time out, and I actually picked Gutierrez to win that fight. And Pedro Munoz surprised me. 36 years old, Pedro Munoz. Has he got one last run at the title? Quite possibly, but that's only if he can get through Marlon Vera this weekend, which will be no easy feat. What I will say is that the next fight on the card is going to be one that probably gets a lot more eyes on it than maybe the co-main event. I haven't heard anything much about the co-main event in comparison to Ian Machado Gary versus Neil Magny. Now, as we know, Ian Gary was supposed to be fighting Jeff Neal. Jeff Neal had to pull out of that one. Ian Gary's 12-0. His last performance against Daniel Rodriguez was without a doubt the best performance of his career. I don't think his UFC career has quite gone the way that he thought it would go. He started with a lot of hype. He came into the company, with a lot of hype at 6-0. Cage Warriors champion, notorious for being a nomadic fighter. Going from gym to gym to gym, and now he's in the UFC. Finishes his first fight with 1 second to go in the first round, then goes to back-to-back decisions. But then the win against Kenyan Song, despite being dropped in that fight, big finish in the third round. And then the Daniel Rodriguez finish was just absolutely phenomenal. Head kick to ground strikes. A phenomenal performance by Ian Gary, and one that's really kind of put him out there on, really got his name out there and set up the fight against Jeff Neal. Now, at welterweight, Ian Gary's ranked 13, Jeff Neal was ranked 8. It's disappointing that he now has to sort of fight down slightly the division against Neil Magny, but in my opinion, Neil Magny is a more difficult fight for Ian Gary. But Ian Gary was calling for the Neil Magny fight before the Jeff Neal fight. And Neil Magny's game as a badger, he's coming off the split decision victory against Phil Rowe last time out, and it is going to be a phenomenal fight. Neil Magny's going to ask Ian Gary more questions than he's ever been asked in his career, in my opinion, and I can't wait for that fight. Unofficially, my pick is going to be Neil Magny. I think he's probably just got a more well-rounded game than Ian Gary to get it done. He's a very different fighter as well to Jeff Neal, But I wouldn't be surprised if Ian Gary ran through Neil Magny. Neil Magny isn't an easy guy to finish. I think he's got 8 finish losses on his record, but these have come against the elite guys, Gilbert Burns, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Santiago Ponzinibbio knocked him out, RDA, Lorenz Larkin, Damian Maia submitted him. These are not, average guys. These are elite guys that are finishing Neil Magny. And if Ian Gary can put himself in that category, it's going to be a massive coming out party for Ian Gary. And the same as that in the co-main event. Zhang Weili returned to action after, to be honest, an underwhelming, quite a boring fight against Carla Esparza last time out, because it was just so one-sided. Of course she was going to beat Carla Esparza, with the greatest respect to Carla. Zhang Weili is just on a different level, and she beat her at her own game, which is the most worrying thing for Carla Esparza. These two girls match up really well, Zhang Weili 23-3, Amanda Lemos 13-2-1, height 5'4", 5'4", reach 63 to 65. A similar age. Zhang Weili is 2 years older. 2 years younger. Strikes landed per minute 5.79 for the champ, 4.51 for the challenger. Strikes absorbed per minute 4.06 for the champ, 3.97 for the challenger. Takedowns pretty much the same. Zhang Weili lands pretty much 2 takedowns as opposed to Amanda Lemos' 1 takedown. Takedown defense 66% for the champ, 81% for the challenger. They're just very, very similar fighters. They're just very similar fighters with a very similar record. And what's most important for me is this fight is going to be a banger, straight up. You had Zhang Weili now coming off, still technically on the comeback trail. She lost those 2 fights to Rose Namajunas. She had that spinning back fist knockout of Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Then she had the dominant victory over Carla Esparza last time out. Similar for Amanda Lemos, she obviously lost by a standing standing arm triangle choke to Jessica Andrade. She then returned with a guillotine choke over Michelle Waterson Gomez, and then she knocked out Marina Rodriguez last time out in November of last year. She's got a lot of potential as Amanda Lemos, but she got a lot of potential. She's got very heavy hands, and she's got a pretty dangerous ground game. What I will say, however, is I genuinely think that this is going to be an easy fight for Zhang Weili. I think she's just on a different level. Amanda Lemos is kind of, in my opinion, not that she doesn't deserve the title shot, because I really do think she does. I don't think that she's the best. She's been kicked down the rankings from Tatiana Suarez's big performance last week. I think Yang Xiaonan was more deserving of a title shot than Amanda Lemos. I think Tatiana Suarez now is more deserving of a title shot than Amanda Lemos. I think there's girls in and around the top 10 and top 15 that beat Amanda Lemos with relative ease, which is a shame to say, but these things happen. And I think Zhang Weili is going to make it look easy. She's going to be the heavier hitter on the feet, and when she wants to, she'll mix in the ground game. I think she'll win with ease, which is not what I can say with any confidence in the main event. Aljamain Sterling returning for yet another title defense against Sean O'Malley. Now, Sean O'Malley is coming off the biggest win of his UFC career. Well, one of the biggest wins of his UFC career against Petr Yan. Yes, it was a split decision. You have to take into account that Petr Yan had his back up against the wall in that fight and still wasn't able to get the victory. Maybe the best striker in the division, Sean O'Malley. He's going to come. He's going to really embrace the whole entire fight week. Him and Aljo have been taking sort of jabs at each other for months on social media. It's been fun. I can't deny it has been fun. But what I will say is that Sean O'Malley has holes in his game that Aljamain Sterling can certainly expose. I'm not talking about the grappling game, because we have seen him dominated on the floor a couple of times, Sean O'Malley, but he's always got back to his feet, and more often than not, he's finished his opponent. He does compete in a lot of no-gi grappling tournaments outside of the UFC, but it's the cardio that can be an issue. And we know that Aljo's cardio is never an issue, and it never will be an issue. And it's the susceptibility to the low leg kick. Now we saw. I've got two articles coming out this week ranking Sean O'Malley's wins. It's been a pleasure to go through all of Sean O'Malley's fights because he's fucking good. And the second article that I've got coming out this week, amongst others, but specifically on Sean O'Malley, or on this fight, I should say, is 3 scenarios in which this fight could play out. I think if Sean O'Malley's going to win this fight, he's got to knock Aljamain Sterling out. I don't think Aljamain Sterling has to finish Sean O'Malley to win this fight. I think Aljamain Sterling can do what he did against Petr Yan, who, let's be honest, is a similar blueprint to O'Malley, a very, very good striker with decent takedown defense, but maybe lacks slightly in the ground game. I think it's kind of a rinse and repeat for Aljo against Sean O'Malley. He's got to rinse and repeat what he did against Petr Yan in that rematch against Sean O'Malley, and he gets the victory, in my opinion. What will be more difficult is getting Sean O'Malley to the floor. It's not because he's got better takedown defense, but he's got far better footwork than Petr Yan. I didn't quite realize just how, like I said, I've been watching a lot of Sean O'Malley's fights this week. I didn't quite realize just how good Sean O'Malley's footwork is. Of course, it's always been phenomenal. Sean O'Malley's been known for his in and out movements, quick footwork, his feints, and everything that comes with that. But it's the little intricacies that you don't maybe notice when you're watching it live, or watching a fight for the first time. Just a subtle change of direction sometimes that Sean O'Malley manages to do. He'll step heavy on the right and then sort of glide off to the left, and that right will come round, switch stance, bang, and the right will go down the pipe. Aljamain Sterling's really got to be careful that he doesn't get sort of mesmerized by Sean O'Malley's movement, because he's one of the best he's one of the best strikers in the division, but he's also one of the best feinters in the division. He'll constantly throw the upper or dummy the uppercut. He'll constantly, dummy hooks. His hips will constantly be flexing and be twitching, and sometimes even be loaded, ready to throw a kick. And Aljo can't bite on these feints, and he can't do what he did against O'Malley in that first fight, and just against Petr Yan in that first fight, and just sort of almost go to kind of hug him and try and chase the takedown, because he will get knocked out in this one. Sean O'Malley's footwork is good enough to step back, bang, land the big looping hook down the pipe and knock him out, like we saw against Raulian Paiva, like we saw against Jose Quinones. He landed that huge head kick, and then as Quinones were trying to sort of grasp for the legs, bang, big uppercut, and then ground and pound finished it off. But I do think that Aljamain Sterling holds a massive advantage in this one, and what the massive advantage is in this one is experience over 5 rounds. Sean O'Malley has never been scheduled for 5 rounds, let alone gone 5 rounds. If you compare that to Aljamain Sterling, he's a pro at 5-round fights. Went 5 rounds with Henry Cejudo, was scheduled for 5 rounds against TJ Dillashaw, obviously finished that one early. Went 5 rounds with Petr Yan. Went 4.5 hard rounds with Petr Yan the first time round. And he's just experienced a high level. If you look at the guys on the resume of Aljamain Sterling, you've got Brett Johns, Cody Stamann, Jimmy Rivera, Pedro Munoz, Corey Sandhagen, Petr Yan twice, TJ Dillashaw, and Henry Cejudo. You compare that to Sean O'Malley, no disrespect, but you've got, since he's lost to Marlon Vera, which was a legitimate loss. Yes, he had the leg injury, but that leg injury was caused by Marlon Vera attacking the legs. But you've got Thomas Almeida, an extremely out of form Thomas Almeida, who had lost, he'd lost 3 fights prior to the Sean O'Malley fight, and hadn't competed in hadn't competed in 6 months. So it's not okay. That's neither here nor there. But he then went 3 rounds with Chris Martinho, a man who entered that fight on a week's notice, maybe 2 weeks' notice. He then lost to Pedro Munoz. He then had a no contest with Pedro Munoz in a 3-round fight. He then went 3 hard rounds with Petr Yan, but did seem to fade at the end of that fight. For me, Aljamain Sterling is going to take over this fight in the last 2 rounds. He's going to win the last 2 rounds. Rounds 4 and 5, I really do think that are Aljamain Sterling rounds. If he can bank either rounds 1, 2, or 3, I think he wins the fight via unanimous decision, probably 3-2, maybe even 4-1. He needs to bank one of those early rounds, whether it be the first, second, or third, because I really do think that his cardio and his experience of 5-round fights is going to take over in 4 and 5. If Sterling can bank, maybe let's say rounds 1 and 2, he can lose round 3, and then he can bank 4 or 5. I think Sterling wins this by a unanimous decision, based on the fact that Sean O'Malley may gas. He's got susceptibility to being kicked in the leg and hurt to the leg. But Aljamain Sterling's style does also kind of play into Sean O'Malley's style. He's a wade forward and does get hit kind of striker. He will bring the fight to Sean O'Malley, and Sean O'Malley will happily counter-strike, and counter-strike well. What is concerning about this fight for me is that I don't want it to be a boring fight. I don't want it to be any controversy. Whoever wins, I just want them to accept the fact that their opponent was better in this one. And maybe we'll get a rematch further down the line, but this is a massive fight for both men. Aljamain Sterling has the chance to really cement his legacy in the GOAT conversation at bantamweight, and Sean O'Malley has the opportunity to really cement himself as, the champion, and kind of live up to the hype that the UFC have put on him and that he's put on himself. It's an absolutely phenomenal fight. I am picking Aljamain Sterling. I do think his 5-round experience is going to take over slightly in this one. But would I be surprised? I'm picking Aljamain Sterling. I'm recording this on Monday. Obviously, it's going out on Tuesday, but I'm picking Aljamain Sterling. Will that change? the more, the more podcasts I listen to, the more sort of interviews I watch, the more content that I consume this week, the more articles that I read, quite possibly, the more analysis that I read, quite possibly, there is a chance that my pick changes to Sean O'Malley. I'm not sure if it will, but we'll have to wait and see when the MMA Sucker Staff picks come out. So that's today's podcast done and dusted now, folks. I appreciate you sticking by me. Like I said, we're going to have a little bit of a feeling out process, as it were. We're going to take a round off, as it were, while I get used to doing the podcast on my own every week. Because there was so much to talk about this week, I didn't want to bring in any of the new features, but I'm going to look at, I'm going to spitball. I'm going to really, brainstorm. I'm going to speak to Jeremy Brand, obviously the king of MMA Sucker, and I'm going to speak to the MMA Sucker guys. I'm going to try and take a lot of inspiration from other podcasts as well. I don't want to be rambling on for an hour on my own every week, just talking about the fights that were and the fights that are coming up. I want to bring in new features. I want to bring in discussing fight announcements, which may even be an extra pod per week, depending on, personal schedule and timings and whatnot. I want to bring in a few, like I said, a few interviews, a few guests every few weeks. I want to really make this podcast something that I'm proud of the podcast now. I was really proud of the podcast with Tim, but I want to take how proud I am of the podcast and really enhance it and really look to go that extra mile. Of course, this will be uploaded to YouTube, but also upload into Spotify and Apple Podcasts every single week. MMA Sucker Podcast, Frazer Krohn here. Keep it locked to MMA Sucker, Frazer Krohn MMA on Twitter, MMA Sucker on Instagram. That's where a lot of the content will be coming out. And keep an eye on Instagram as well, because I think this week I'm going to set up for those that don't know, I got my MMA account hacked on Instagram. I don't have access to it anymore, which is a fucking ball ache, but it is what it is. I'm going to set up a new MMA Instagram where I'll be mainly promoting the podcast on it, promoting my own articles, getting you guys hyped for the week that's coming up. So, like I said, I appreciate all your time. I appreciate the fact that you've stuck by me for listening to me ramble on. I appreciate the fact that maybe you were coming here to listen to Tim and you've stuck around to listen to me. I'll be back next week breaking down UFC 292, looking ahead to the week that is. We've got a UFC Fight Night, Holloway versus Korean Zombie. Hella excited for that. We've got some massive fights on that card as well that I'll be breaking down. We've got PFL 9 as well next week. We've got PFL 8 this week, but forgive me, I'm not that interested in the card now that Brendan's not in there and Kayla's not in there. You've got Larissa Pacheco this week competing, but for me, it is what it is with PFL this year. We'll be focusing on the UFC. We had a Bellator card this weekend. Again, forgive me, not interested. Stick with me, guys. It's a work in progress at the moment, but I'm hoping that we can, continue to get the views, continue to get, world-class analysis. And thank you for listening. And I'll speak to you all guys next week. Thank you very much.